Okay, today we're going to look at the quest for the historical Jesus. And the main text we're going to use is Abel's Reason, Faith, and Tradition. So, in chapter 2, Abel starts out by asking the question, what can we know by using the historical critical methods? What can we know about Jesus? Right? Now, again, this is a theological text, and so we are coming from the belief that God exists. And in this case, as Christian theologians, right, I'm coming at you with the idea that I believe that Jesus was fully human and fully divine, or fully human and fully God. Now, what do we mean by human? Human, we can relate that to the perceptible stuff, right? These are things that could be verified using the historical critical method. Things like archaeology, things like textual criticism. This is the use of reason applied to the things that we can see, the things that we can sense with our senses, and therefore validate by sharing with each other. So if we dig in the ground and we find certain archaeological evidence, we can show that to everyone, and then we can make conclusions based on that. So we can tell things like where Jesus lived, somewhat what he did. We can have an idea of the nature of the documents that report what Jesus did. Now, for the divine aspects of Jesus, we're talking about the way he is God, right? Or the way he is the transcendent, the source of all being that gives life to all being, right? We can't sense the transcendent. We can't prove that the transcendent exists. Now, some of us believe in the transcendent for good reason. We have reasons to believe it, including personal experience and the experience of others. But it's not like a piece of pottery that we might find in an archaeological dig. We can't point to it and say, everybody here see that? And everybody who could see would see it. No, when it comes to the transcendent, we cannot prove it because we cannot prove its existence because the transcendent is beyond human perception. And therefore, it can't be verified by using the historical critical method or any other kind of science. So the historical critical method just means using contemporary scientific and analytic methods to try to understand some historical events or historical texts. So using the historical critical method, sometimes we may discover that some things in Scripture are symbolic, that they were not historical events, and likely were not intended to be understood as historical events, but as some kind of analogy or teaching story. However, using the historical critical method, we can also discover that some other things in Scripture or in the Bible, is another way to say it when we're talking about the Christian scriptures, were historical events, or likely were historical events, right? Things that actually happened, similar or just like it says in those passages. But the divine nature of Jesus, just like the transcendent or God or the divine itself, cannot be verified using these kind of methods, because it is not something that is immediately perceptible to the human condition. So, for example, an archaeologist could dig up dinosaur bones in the earth, and we could say, oh, look, there's dinosaur bones. Looks like there was some creature that was made out of these bones. Or who these bones belong to. You can't do that with God. You can't do that with the divine nature of Jesus Christ. Now, it would be theoretically possible, say, to find the remains of King Herod or Saint Joseph or Saint John the Baptist. We might be able to verify that person's existence. But as far as using the historical critical method, which includes archaeology, among other methods, to say whether Jesus was divine or not, you can't do it. So just a little reminder, when I'm talking about the transcendent, I'm not just talking about that which is outside of human perception. Right? See, I'll have this little egg here represent the universe, the perceptible universe to human beings. Some people get the idea like, hey, if you flew to the edge of space, or if you somehow fell out, went beyond the human perceptual realm, you would find yourself in the transcendent. But it's out there, it's not in here. No, transcend means to climb beyond. And therefore, the beyond, to go beyond, you must be within. So the transcendent is that which is in the universe. It's in, through, and beyond the perceptible universe. It's like the analogy we use that creation is in the womb of God. We're contained, we're held into existence by God. So God is in us. God runs through us. God gives us our being and connects us together, holds us in being, so to speak. But he also goes beyond the realm of our perception. So the divine nature of Christ can't be verified using the historical critical method. And again, so the HCM, the historical critical method, can't prove or disprove Jesus' divinity. Okay, so we've got that set. So what can the historical critical method tell us about Jesus's life? Well, not a whole lot. There's very little historical evidence about Jesus' life outside of Scripture, right? Outside of what the New Testament and other writings of the New Testament writings in the late first and early second centuries. There are some writings that were not included in Scripture that maybe can tell us a little bit about, give us some evidence about the historical Jesus, but those writings are probably not very helpful, even less helpful than for the most part, less helpful than the Gospels and other New Testament writings. If they were more reliable, some of them that were written early enough, some of them might be included in the Gospel, but some of these writings were not included because they didn't fit with what the apostles and other people who knew Jesus said about him. So we really don't have that much to work with. Some people may ask, who cares? some legitimate and good Bible scholars today and theologians think that we spend too much time on this. Really think that as far as being the people of God, benefiting from Jesus, the revelation that Jesus gave us, the way that Jesus shared the nature of God with us, we really shouldn't focus so much on the historical Jesus, trying to reconstruct what he was like when he was incarnate 2,000 years ago. But we should focus on the experience of Christ in our lives throughout history. So Luke Timothy Johnson, for one, says the real Jesus is found when Christians encounter Christ in the religious experiences and convictions based on the New Testament. Right? And you have to at least agree with him. This is what makes someone a Christian for their own, in their own way. A lot of us are born into the Christian tradition, and we might, say I'm Christian, and we believe what our parents and our church and our schools have taught us to some degree, but that's very different from someone who has experienced those truths that were passed down for themselves, right? Some people talk about having a personal relationship with Christ. Other people talk about witnessing the teachings of Christ in their own life, right? And other people will talk about various transcendent experiences that fit with what the gospel said, that correspond to what Jesus did and taught. The theologian Cardinal Avery Dulles, so he was a cardinal, which meant that he was one of the men who could help to elect a new pope. He was also a Jesuit, the Society of Jesus, that is a Catholic religious order. And he was also an ordained priest. But he's most famous for being this theologian, or someone who writes about God, and in his case, ecclesiology, the nature of the church. He said, we shouldn't spend too much time on trying to identify the historical Jesus, because using the historical critical method, we just don't know enough about Jesus. It doesn't teach us enough about Christ. It doesn't really even give us enough to create a religion around. There's not really enough there even to say, what's the meaning of life and how should we live our lives? It's not even there. Now, other theologians are more into the importance of the historical nature of Christ in our faith. For example, the bishops of Vatican II, which was the last ecumenical council of the Catholic Church. So all the Catholic bishops, and actually the Orthodox bishops, were all invited too, as well as bishops and leaders from other Christian communities. But in the case of the formations of these documents, the bishops, the Catholic bishops, stated when they all came together to talk about how they can present and live the faith today, they asserted that there is a historical nature of Christ revealed through the Gospels. So the big quote is, the four Gospels whose historical character the Church unhesitatingly asserts. In other words, these Gospels are historical in nature. Now, that doesn't mean that everything in them is a historical fact, but they they pass on what Jesus did, right? And we'll see there's some differences between them. So again, they're not saying it's all word for word exact factual reporting, but it does have the essence of what Christ taught for the salvation of human beings, in a more or less historically accurate way, right? So that's the point I make down here. And you can, this is, when I put it in the non-black type, it usually means that it's my ideas. I don't want to give people the idea that, oh, Abel said this, because that would be appropriating ideas to him that he might not be interested in appropriating. Okay, anyways, by saying historical character and faithfully handed on, that means a reliable, accurate account, right? It doesn't mean that it's a perfect report of historical facts. But they are emphasizing that there is a historical nature to this. And that kind of is important to Christianity, because Christianity is essentially, in some ways, about God becoming a human being. I mean, that's kind of one of the most essential aspects of our faith, that God became a human being so that human beings could become God through union with God, right? He became one of us so that we could become part of him. So the fact that there's a historical accuracy to that, that it actually happened, it's not just an idea. This is kind of crucial to Christianity. So the bishops of Vatican II and other theologians who do value the quest for the historical Jesus have good theological reason to do so. Right, and that's what I'm writing about here. Well, sorry, this Abel is making the point here too, because we really believe that God became a human being. So Christian beliefs about Jesus should be historically plausible. This is Abel gets into that thing about reason. Like, nothing in our faith should go against reason. Nothing in it should be unbelievable into the way that it's disproven by facts, that it's disproven by what we can reasonably perceive. So if we have, for example, there was a movie out a few years ago about a priest who was somehow involved in finding the body of Jesus. And for some reason, archaeologists were certain that this was Jesus' body. Okay, this was a fictional movie. Okay, this is not something that actually happened. But anyway, in this fictional movie, this was kind of a crisis of faith for this man, because, again, if part of the Christian faith is that Christ rose from the dead, well, what does that mean then if his body was found? It's always been part of the seed of faith that his body was that his body was gone, right? We'll look at that. The empty tomb was what kind of opened up faith, the possibility of faith in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So if something like that would happen, well, then, we'd have to say, oh, maybe maybe our belief was wrong. But like I said, that didn't happen, right? So there's nothing about believing the resurrection of Christ. There is nothing that is against historical evidence to believe in his bodily resurrection. Now, we'll go on a little bit about what that means. His bodily resurrection, it doesn't mean that his corpse was suddenly resuscitated. Okay. So the way I'd put it is that the historical critical method on its own cannot give us a detailed description of Jesus Christ. Right? Those kind of ideas are off. We really can't get that. We just don't have enough evidence. But what it can do is help us understand what is recorded in the scripture about Jesus by helping us understand the context in which those things were shared and written down. So we can really get a lot about the understanding of Christ by the people who knew him, what they wrote down, what they did. We really learn a lot about the faith, beliefs, lives of the apostles, and what those events and words meant to them in their time. So that's very important, because that really is what our faith is about. We share in the faith of the apostles, those people who witnessed and experienced the resurrection of Christ. And so if we come to understand them and what it meant to them and what they meant to say and how they said it, that is really where the historical critical method helps us. It's not going to prove what Jesus was like exactly, but it can help us understand what he was like and what the people who experienced him in their lives were like. The people who were the first to share in our faith.